Forget everything you've read in the history books. History is not a quiet archive. It is a grand stage, flooded with footlights, where the real drama unfolds behind velvet curtains. Today, we will raise the curtain on one such story. And believe me, its plot is wilder than anything you could imagine. Picture this: the British Empire, the 19th century. The crown awaits its heir, but fate, like a mad gambler, begins to shuffle the deck. One by one, those in line for the throne leave this world under strange and tragic circumstances. It was a parade of ghosts, a grim procession of losses that cleared the way for an underdog nobody saw coming. A little girl, locked in a gilded cage. Are you sure you know this woman? Queen Victoria, a name that became an era. The image that likely comes to mind is that of a prim widow in perpetual mourning, a symbol of morality and imperial grandeur. But that is merely an icy mask, crafted for the public. We will pull it back and show you the real Victoria, the girl who suffocated under her mother's control, the ruler who survived 6 assassination attempts and coolly used herself as bait to catch the assassins, the woman who despised being pregnant and confessed to finding newborns repulsive. We will look inside her secret diaries to understand how a great love became a lifelong obsession, and we will uncover the truth about the curse that flowed from her veins into the royal houses of Europe. Prepare yourself. The story you are about to hear will forever change the way you see Queen Victoria. And so it begins on May 24th, 1819. In Kensington Palace, the cry of a newborn girl, Alexandrina Victoria, echoed through the halls. At that moment, no one could have imagined that this cry was a prelude to the thunderous voice of an entire epic. Her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, was merely the 4th son of the reigning King George III, a monarch whose mind had long been lost in the fog-bound labyrinths of madness. In the line of succession, a whole procession stood before little Victoria. Her powerful uncles, the future Kings George IV and William IV, and other potential heirs. Her birth was little more than a byproduct of the desperate great heir race, a frantic scramble by the old king's sons to produce a legitimate successor for the dynasty. It seemed her destiny was a quiet, aristocratic life on the fringes of history, an arranged marriage, and polite smiles at court. But fate, as we know, has a twisted sense of humor and a penchant for the most unexpected scripts. The first blow of a sinister destiny struck before Victoria was even a year old. Her father, a robust and healthy man, died suddenly after a common cold. Just like that, the girl lost not only her father, but also her chief protector. Her mother, the German Princess Victoire of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, was left alone in a foreign country, saddled with enormous debts, and a tiny daughter who was now suddenly much closer to the throne. The widowed Duchess of Kent fell completely under the influence of her advisor, an Irish adventurer with ice-cold eyes named Sir John Conroy. This was the man contemporaries whispered was her mother's lover and evil genius, the very architect of the prison in which the future queen would be raised. Together, they devised a monstrous system of total control that came to be known as the Kensington System. Its official purpose was to shield the young princess from the moral decay of the royal court. In reality, it was a sophisticated form of psychological torture, designed to break the girl's will and turn her into a submissive puppet. Imagine a world where you have no private moments. Victoria was forbidden to cry in public, for it was unbecoming of a princess. She was forbidden from playing with other children. Instead, her companions were 132 wooden dolls for whom she painstakingly stitched outfits in the oppressive silence of her chambers. Every step she took, every bite she ate, every word she read was recorded in special journals. She was never left alone. Even at night, her bed was placed in her mother's own bedroom. When she walked down a staircase, she was required to hold an adult's hand, not out of concern for her safety, but to deny her even a fleeting moment alone with her own thoughts. Her life became a performance for an audience of two, her mother and the sinister shadow of Conroy. Victoria herself would later describe her childhood with a single word: melancholy. But behind that reserved aristocratic label lay an abyss of loneliness and quiet desperation. It was not a life. It was the slow suffocation of a soul. Meanwhile, the grand imperial stage continued to empty. One by one, those who stood between Victoria and the throne vanished. Her uncle, the Duke of York, died childless. Then came the turn of the king himself, George IV. The crown passed to his brother, William IV, an elderly and childless monarch. And then, at the age of 11, Victoria was confronted with a terrifying truth. There was no one left standing between her and the status of the most powerful woman on earth. This new reality turned her gilded cage into a battlefield. The Duchess and Conroy redoubled their efforts. Their plan was simple: to drive the girl into a state of total dependency so that when the old king was gone, they could rule in her name as regents. They dragged her on exhausting royal tours across the country, which were, in reality, a PR campaign for their own future regency. During one such tour, Victoria fell gravely ill, but her mother and Conroy refused to call for doctors, trying instead to force the weakened girl to sign a document appointing Conroy as her personal secretary. She did not yield. Even then, within that fragile girl, the iron will of her ancestors was awakening. Her only ally was on the throne. King William IV loathed his sister-in-law, the Duchess of Kent, and despised Conroy, seeing their naked ambition for what it was. He understood the fate of the empire rested on one thing: his ability to stay alive until his niece came of age. And he turned his life into a race against time. The story of what happened at his birthday banquet in 1836 is legendary. Raising his glass, the king declared for all to hear that he prayed to God he might live until Victoria's 18th birthday, for he had no wish to see the regency fall into the hands of that evil woman. And here he pointed directly at the Duchess. This was a public declaration of war, and the king kept his word. He clung to life with the stubbornness of an old sea dog. On May 24th, 1837, Victoria turned 18. She had come of age, and just 1 month later, on June 20th at 5 o'clock in the morning, the old king drew his last breath. An hour later, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace. The young woman was woken and asked to come downstairs. She entered the room alone, wearing a simple dressing gown, her hair unbound. And there, in the pre-dawn stillness, 2 old men knelt before her and informed her that she was Queen of Great Britain. In that moment, her childhood ended and her era began. The new queen's first taste of freedom was the air in her own private chambers. Immediately after the archbishop left, she demanded an hour entirely to herself, an unheard-of luxury she had never in her life been granted. And in that silence, her plan was likely born, a plan that was cold, calculated, and ruthless. Her mother and Sir John Conroy were already savoring their triumph. They were certain the young, inexperienced girl would be a pliable instrument in their hands. But they had fatally miscalculated. They had spent years forging steel, believing they were molding wax. At her very first meeting of the Privy Council, Victoria stunned the assembled gray-haired politicians. Instead of a frightened girl, they saw a short but incredibly dignified figure who read her address in a firm, clear voice, without a moment's hesitation. The old lords, accustomed to the eccentric outbursts of her uncles, stared at her in astonishment. This was not merely an heir, this was a natural-born ruler. And then the hour of reckoning arrived. Victoria did not act impulsively, but with surgical precision. To Sir John Conroy, the man who had poisoned her childhood, she made a polite but unyielding offer. He could accept a peerage and a generous pension and disappear from her life forever, or he could face public scandal and total ruin. Humiliated and crushed, Conroy chose exile. The next blow was struck against her own mother. Victoria had the Duchess of Kent moved to the most distant apartments in Buckingham Palace and reduced their interactions to an icy, formal minimum. A simple order to have her own bed moved to a separate bedroom became an act of deafening emancipation. For 18 years, she had slept under supervision. Now, at last, she could breathe freely in the darkness of her own room. Her revenge was not bloody or loud. It was far more terrifying. It was the complete and total erasure of yesterday's tyrants from her new reality. She didn't just slam the door on her past, she bricked it over. Having found her freedom, the young queen dove headfirst into her new life. She adored balls, the opera, and society events. Her chief mentor and support in the first years of her reign was the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. The elderly, cynical, and charming aristocrat became the father she never knew. He taught her the subtleties of politics, the intricacies of court etiquette, and, most importantly, treated her with warmth and respect. Their relationship was so close that malicious tongues at court whispered of a romantic attachment, and the public even nicknamed Victoria Mrs. Melbourne. But in truth, she was simply desperate for a wise and steady shoulder to lean on after years of isolation. However, the politicians and the public understood. The Queen needed more than a mentor. She needed a husband, a consort who would secure the dynasty and be her rock for life. And a candidate for this role had long since been chosen. His name was Albert. He was her first cousin on her mother's side, a prince from the tiny German duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their mutual relatives, especially their ambitious uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, saw this union as the perfect match. Victoria and Albert had first met when they were both 16, but the encounter had left no particular impression on her. A new meeting was arranged for October 1839. Albert and his brother Ernst arrived at Windsor Castle, and this time everything was different. The moment Victoria saw him, her world was turned upside down. Standing before her was not just a German prince, but the embodiment of all her girlhood dreams. He is extremely handsome. His hair is about the same color as mine. His eyes are large and blue, and he has a beautiful nose," she gushed in her diary. She was struck not only by his looks, but by his intellect, his education, and his seriousness. He possessed none of the courtly insincerity and flattery she had grown so accustomed to. A deep connection sparked between them instantly, based not just on sudden passion, but on an astonishing kinship of souls. Albert, like Victoria, had endured an unhappy childhood. His parents had divorced after his mother's infidelity, and he had grown up in the shadow of this family scandal, feeling lonely and misunderstood. They talked for hours, played the piano together, and with each passing day, Victoria realized she had found not just a suitable candidate for a husband, but her other half. But there was one problem. According to protocol, no one could propose to a reigning monarch. The initiative had to come from her. Just 5 days after his arrival, she summoned her courage. Victoria called Albert to her private blue closet, and there, alone together, this young woman, who only 2 years earlier had broken free from oppression, asked for his hand in marriage. For the Victorian era, it was an unthinkable, revolutionary act. But she was already accustomed to breaking rules that did not suit her. They were married on February 10th, 1840. That day marked the beginning not only of their personal story, but of a new cultural tradition. Contrary to the custom of royal brides marrying in gowns of brocade or silver cloth, Victoria insisted on a simple white satin dress. The choice symbolized purity, innocence, and the start of a new life. She wanted to appear before her beloved not as a powerful queen, but simply as a woman entering a marriage for love. Photographs and engravings of her wedding were distributed across the globe, and thousands of brides on both sides of the Atlantic yearned to look like the young queen. And so, thanks to one sincere romantic impulse, the tradition of the white wedding dress was born, a tradition that lives on to this day. For Victoria, this marriage was more than a dynastic alliance. It was her greatest conquest, her personal victory. She had gained not just a husband and advisor, but the only person she could trust unconditionally. Her loneliness was finally over. The union of Victoria and Albert was more than just a happy marriage. It created a cult, the cult of the perfect family. Portraits of them, surrounded by their 9 rosy-cheeked children, adorned homes across the empire, from aristocratic mansions to humble cottages. They became the living embodiment of Victorian values: duty, piety, and strong family bonds. Victoria, the queen and mother of the nation, appeared to be a model for all to follow. But as is so often the case, the facade displayed for public consumption concealed a complex and far from idyllic reality. Behind the closed doors of the palace, the queen was waging a quiet war, a war against the very nature of motherhood, which she perceived not as a gift, but as a heavy burden, almost a humiliation to her status and her identity. This struggle reveals what is perhaps the most unexpected and contradictory side of her character. Her first enemy was the state of pregnancy itself. For Victoria, a woman who had spent her entire youth fighting for control over her own life and body, the 9 months of carrying a child were a period of utter powerlessness. She hated the physical changes, the morning sickness, and the loss of her regal posture. In her letters and diaries, she called it the shadow side of marriage and compared herself to a cow or a rabbit, reduced to a purely biological, animalistic function. The process stripped her of her individuality, transforming her from a sovereign into a mere incubator for the dynasty. Each time the doctors confirmed another pregnancy, she would fall into despair. Behind the 9 children who, a rarity for the era, all survived to adulthood, lay years of physical and emotional discomfort for their mother. She was fulfilling her duty to the crown, but she did it with the revulsion of a soldier marching into a battle he despises. But if pregnancy was an ordeal, the arrival of a newborn brought her no relief. On the contrary, her antipathy only intensified. Victoria was utterly devoid of what is commonly called the maternal instinct. She felt no tenderness at the sight of an infant. In her letters to her eldest daughter, one finds shocking confessions. She wrote that newborns were rather disgusting, ugly, and looked like frogs. She could not understand how anyone could find charm in these wrinkled, helpless, and constantly screaming creatures. This cold, almost clinical view of infancy was the complete opposite of the sentimental image that was circulated among the public. For her, a child only became interesting once it began to walk, talk, and show signs of a personality. Until then, it was merely an object, a source of inconvenience and noise that disturbed her peace and distracted her from far more important matters, governing an empire and conversing with her beloved husband. This emotional void was more than filled by Albert. It was he who, defying the traditions of his time, took on the role of chief educator and caregiver. He was not just a father, he was the true mother to his children. Albert personally designed the nurseries, developed their educational programs, and selected their governesses and tutors. He spent far more time with the children than Victoria did, playing with them, reading to them, and monitoring their progress. Victoria gladly delegated these duties to him, preferring to observe from a distance. She loved her children, but her love was abstract, almost official. She loved them as her heirs, as the continuation of her dynasty, but she rarely showed the warm, unconditional affection they craved. Her relationship with each of them was a unique and often difficult drama, where love was tightly interwoven with disappointment, pride, and jealousy. This was most vividly demonstrated in her relationships with her 2 eldest children. Her firstborn, Princess Victoria, or Vicky, was a carbon copy of her father, brilliantly intelligent, inquisitive, and talented. The Queen was proud of her daughter, but at the same time, she subconsciously competed with her for Albert's attention. When Vicky grew up and married the heir to the Prussian throne, she and her mother exchanged thousands of letters. This correspondence is an astonishing document, blending tenderness, advice, and endless reproaches. Victoria controlled her daughter's every move from afar, criticizing her parenting methods and political decisions. It was a completely different story with the heir to the throne, Albert Edward, known in the family as Bertie. He was the polar opposite of his sister, cheerful, charming, but with no inclination for academics. Albert devised a brutal educational system for him, designed to mold him into an ideal monarch, but which in the end only broke him. Victoria, who adored her husband, saw in her son only a distorted reflection. She considered Bertie lazy, frivolous, and dissolute, and she carried this disappointment with her for the rest of her life. Her relationships with her youngest children were also fraught. Her son, Leopold, was born with the royal disease, hemophilia, a genetic disorder for which Victoria herself was a carrier. Her love for him was tinged with constant fear and guilt. She kept him on a tight leash, protecting him from the slightest scratch, and this suffocating care turned his life into a series of restrictions. But the pinnacle of her maternal selfishness was the story of her youngest daughter, Beatrice. After Albert's death, Beatrice became her mother's personal secretary and constant companion. Victoria could not bear the thought that her baby, her final consolation, would ever leave her side. When Beatrice fell in love and dared to ask for permission to marry, the queen flew into a rage. She refused to speak to her daughter for 6 months, communicating with her only through notes. Eventually, she relented, but on one cruel condition. Beatrice and her husband had to live with her in the palace and never leave her. It was as if she was trying to keep at least one child for herself, turning her into a hostage of her love and her loneliness. And so, the irony of fate reached its zenith. The woman who had fought so desperately for her own freedom from a mother's tyranny became, for her own children, a source of control, driven not by a thirst for power, but by fear and a selfish love. Life on the throne is not only about balls and parades, but also about constantly being in the crosshairs. For Victoria, these crosshairs were not always metaphorical. During her reign, she was the target of at least 6 serious assassination attempts. But if the attackers expected to see fear in the Queen's eyes, they were met with bitter disappointment. Victoria possessed a sang-froid that would have been the envy of any guards officer. She faced danger with an icy composure that both awed and unnerved her subjects. This woman, whom many considered a product of a sheltered upbringing, was in fact forged from the same imperial steel as the ships of her fleet. Each attempt did not weaken her, but only tempered her, turning her into a living symbol of the indomitable British monarchy. Her first test of mettle came in June 1840. Victoria, then pregnant with her first child, was taking an evening ride in an open carriage with Albert near Buckingham Palace. Suddenly, a young man named Edward Oxford stepped out from the crowd of onlookers and fired 2 shots from a pair of pistols. The bullets whistled past. While the crowd scattered in panic and Albert instinctively shielded his wife, the Queen herself, according to eyewitnesses, merely rose slightly in her seat to get a better look at her assailant. Her pulse did not quicken, not a single muscle twitched on her face. But the most astonishing thing happened the very next day. The police had failed to immediately identify the culprit, so Victoria made an unthinkable decision. She ordered the very same carriage to be prepared and instructed her driver to repeat the previous day's route at the exact same time. It was a brilliant and lethally dangerous move. She had turned herself into bait, correctly reasoning that a vainglorious criminal would not miss the chance to see his victim again. Her calculation paid off. Oxford was spotted in the crowd and apprehended. This single act demonstrated to the entire nation and the world that their queen was no shrinking violet, but a fearless strategist. This incident was merely the first in a long series. She was shot at, had stones thrown at her, and was once threatened with a cane. Her attackers ranged from political radicals to madmen to simply desperate individuals seeking notoriety. But Victoria's reaction was always the same: contemptuous calm. She refused to hide, refused to increase her security, and continued her public appearances as if in defiance of all her enemies. She instinctively understood that a monarch's fear is a crack in the foundation of the state. Her fearlessness was not just a character trait, it was a calculated political tool. However, fate was preparing a blow from which no amount of security could protect her. Victoria's greatest enemy was invisible, and it crept up not with a pistol in hand, but with the quiet, exhausting whisper of an illness that was slowly stealing the most precious thing she had: Prince Albert. Albert had never been in robust health. He was her complete opposite. While Victoria possessed an iron constitution and boundless energy, he suffered from chronic stomach pains, migraines, and bouts of melancholy. He was a workaholic who had shouldered an immense burden of state affairs. Albert was not merely the Queen's husband. He was her unofficial co-ruler, private secretary, chief advisor, and minister without portfolio. He worked himself to the point of exhaustion, reforming the army, organizing the Great Exhibition, and overseeing the improvement of the royal residences. Victoria, who adored him, often dismissed his complaints as hypochondria. She couldn't understand how this brilliant, strong man could be so fragile. She failed to see that he was slowly burning out, like a candle lighting her way. The fatal push towards tragedy came in the autumn of 1861. Rumors leaked to the press about a scandalous liaison between their eldest son, Bertie, and an Irish actress. For the puritanical and highly moral Albert, this news was a devastating blow. He saw his son's actions not as a youthful indiscretion, but as a betrayal of every principle he had tried to instill in him. Already ill and weakened, Albert traveled to Cambridge to confront his son in person. The conversation took place during a long walk in the cold November rain. Albert returned to Windsor completely broken, both morally and physically. His cold quickly developed into a severe illness, which the court physicians diagnosed as typhoid fever. At first, Victoria refused to believe the seriousness of the situation, but her husband's condition worsened by the day. She sat by his bedside, a constant vigil, watching as her universe faded away. In his final days, he no longer recognized her, his mind lost in a fog of delirium. On December 14th, 1861, in the very same room where King William IV had died 22 years earlier, the prince consort's heart stopped. He was only 42 years old. In that moment, Victoria's world went black. Her grief was so all-consuming that it demanded an immediate culprit, and she found one. In her sorrow-clouded mind, she drew a direct and unbreakable line. Bertie's scandal, the trip to Cambridge, the fatal illness. In her eyes, her son had become the indirect cause of his father's death. She would never, ever forgive him. This merciless judgment poisoned their relationship for the rest of her days and barred the heir to the throne from any meaningful role in governing the country as long as she lived. After Albert was gone, Victoria plunged into an endless mourning. She cloaked herself in black, a color she would wear until her own death. And for nearly a decade, she vanished from public life, earning the nickname the Widow of Windsor. She turned her life into a mausoleum, where every day was dedicated to the worship of her late husband's memory. And even when planning her own funeral, she gave instructions that she be laid in her coffin in her white wedding dress and veil. like a bride at long last being reunited with her groom. Her great love had become a great, lifelong sorrow. When Queen Victoria passed away in 1901, she left behind a world changed almost beyond recognition from the one she had entered. Her reign, lasting nearly 64 years, became synonymous with an entire era. Victorian England was the smoking chimneys of Manchester, the first railways weaving a steel web across the country, and the telegraph that allowed messages to cross oceans in minutes. It was the age of the great inventions of Charles Darwin and Michael Faraday, the dark novels of Charles Dickens, and the triumphant splendor of the British Empire, over which, as it was said, the sun never set. Victoria was not the architect of these changes, but she was their symbol, the fixed point in the eye of the storm, an anchor of stability in an age of dizzying transformation. Her image, that of a stern but just mother of the nation, held together this patchwork quilt of colonies, dominions, and industrial cities. Yet this brilliant legacy had a dark side, a legacy passed down not through laws and decrees, but through her very blood. This secret history began quietly, within the walls of the royal nursery. Doctors observing her eighth child, Prince Leopold, began to notice alarming symptoms. The boy was painfully fragile. Any minor bruise would swell into a large, agonizing hematoma. Scratches would bleed for hours, and the loss of a baby tooth became a life-threatening drama. In time, the truth became clear. The prince suffered from a rare and terrible disease, hemophilia. This genetic disorder, passed down through the maternal line, but manifesting almost exclusively in males, impairs the blood's ability to clot. For Leopold, this meant a life lived in constant fear. He was forbidden from active games, horse riding, and any pastime that might lead to injury. Victoria, still grieving the loss of her husband, watched her son suffering with a mixture of horror and guilt. She understood that it was she who had passed this tainted blood to him. Her love for Leopold was suffocating, woven from perpetual anxiety. Her nightmares became reality in 1884, when the 30-year-old prince slipped on a staircase, sustained a head injury that caused a cerebral hemorrhage, and died. But Leopold's tragedy was only the prologue. Victoria, who became known as the Grandmother of Europe, arranged the marriages of her 9 children and 42 grandchildren to the members of nearly every ruling dynasty on the continent. She dreamed of creating a single, peaceful European family, bound by ties of blood. But along with titles and lands, her daughters and granddaughters unknowingly carried the fatal gene into their new families. And so the royal disease began its sinister march through the palaces of Madrid, Berlin, and most tragically, St. Petersburg. Victoria's granddaughter, Alex of Hesse, who became the Russian Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, passed hemophilia to her only son and heir, the Tsarevich Alexei. The boy's illness became the Romanov family's greatest tragedy and a closely guarded state secret. The Empress's desperation to alleviate her son's suffering opened the palace doors to the ominous figure of Grigory Rasputin. It was this Siberian mystic who somehow possessed the ability to stop the Tsarevich's bleeding, who gained boundless influence over the imperial family, discrediting the monarchy in the eyes of the people and becoming one of the catalysts that led to revolution and the collapse of the empire. Thus, an invisible gene originating in the body of an English queen indirectly influenced one of the bloodiest events of the 20th century. But this is where the central mystery arises. Where did Victoria get this gene? Historians and geneticists have meticulously studied her family tree. There is not a single recorded case of hemophilia in the British royal family, nor among her numerous German ancestors. The disease appeared out of nowhere, as if by some dark magic. This has given rise to numerous rumors and theories, one of which is particularly scandalous. It was always whispered at court that Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, had a suspiciously close relationship with her Irish comptroller, John Conroy. The rumors suggested they were lovers, and the most audacious theory is this: Queen Victoria may not have been the daughter of the Duke of Kent, but the product of this secret affair. If Conroy had a history of hemophilia in his family, it would explain everything. This theory, of course, has no direct proof and remains in the realm of palace gossip, but it adds an element of detective mystery to Victoria's story. There is another, more scientific and prosaic explanation. Genetics is a complex lottery, and sometimes glitches occur. Scientists believe the most likely cause was a spontaneous genetic mutation. The gene for hemophilia could have arisen spontaneously in a reproductive cell of either Victoria herself or one of her parents. Some researchers link the increased risk of such mutations to the father's age. The Duke of Kent was over 50 when his daughter was conceived, so it is more than likely that there was no affair. There was only a random, cruel trick of nature. But the mystery remains. Was Victoria the last of the Hanoverian dynasty, or did she carry the blood of a common Irish officer? We will probably never know for sure. But the fact stands, her legacy was twofold. On one side, the brilliant light of the Victorian era, and on the other, a genetic curse that left a bloody trail across the map of Europe. And so, we return to where we began, to the image of a woman in black, frozen in old daguerreotypes. But now, it seems, we can see an entirely different face behind that severe mask. The face of a little girl writing in a diary in an empty room. The face of a young queen breathing the air of freedom for the first time. The face of a passionate lover, a woman willing to break every tradition for her own happiness. And the face of a widow, broken by grief, who mourned not only for her husband, but for herself, for the life that was gone forever along with him. If you look closely, the entire story of Queen Victoria is not a tale of power, empires, or politics. It is an epic of the struggle for control. At first, it was a desperate, quiet war for liberation from external control, a war against her mother's tyranny and John Conroy's manipulations. Her accession to the throne was not simply the receiving of a crown, it was an act of personal emancipation, a declaration of independence. But having thrown off one set of chains, she began, without realizing it, to forge new ones. Having won the battle for her own freedom, she spent the rest of her life trying to establish total control over everything that surrounded her. Her court, her family, her memory. Her domineering love for her children was a desperate attempt to hold on to them, to prevent them from leaving as her father had, as her mentor Melbourne had. She, who had suffered so much from suffocating supervision, became for her own loved ones a source of that same relentless, demanding affection. The death of Albert was, for her, the ultimate loss of control. It was the one catastrophe she could neither foresee nor prevent. And her endless, almost 40-year mourning was not just grief. It was her way of resisting reality, her desperate attempt to stop time. By keeping his rooms unchanged, by demanding that hot water for his shave be brought every morning, she was trying to hold his ghost in this world, refusing to admit her final defeat at the hands of fate. Her black dress was not just a symbol of sorrow. It was armor against a world that had taken the most important thing from her. So who was she? Queen Victoria? A lonely prisoner who became the ruler of an empire, a symbol of family values, who feared and disliked motherhood, an unbending monarch and a fragile woman who, until her dying day, believed she would be reunited with her beloved. Her story is a story of how the deepest childhood traumas shape a personality that then goes on to shape an entire world. She was full of contradictions because, until the very end, the frightened girl from Kensington and the mighty Empress of India were at war within her. And perhaps her greatest legacy is not the era named in her honor, but the astonishing example of how a person, groomed from birth for the role of a puppet, found the strength to become the puppeteer for an entire century.